There are days that I've called out sick, and I wasn't really sick. I just didn't feel like coming in. I didn't get enough sleep. I was out partying in New Orleans with friends too late, couldn't get up, you know. And here was the woman who had just buried her son, who was coming into work. And when we told her, you know, Donna, take some time off. There's no reason for you to be here. Take some time off, you know. Paid vacation is the very least that we can do for you at this point. She said, no, I got a job to do, and I'm going to do it. This coming from a woman that this culture says that she and others like her are pathological and dysfunctional, and that's why they live where they live, right? As opposed to being incredibly hardworking, far more hardworking and virtuous than myself, or just about any of the young white folks I went to Tulane University with, none of whom I'd ever seen exhibit that kind of work ethic either, right? But if you don't know the folks who live in such spaces, if you don't work with them, you don't know that. I remember having conversations with folks in New Orleans when I would tell them what I do. You know, I'd tell folks that I was a community organizer in public housing, and they always had unsolicited advice. Not for me, for the people who lived in public housing, right? I never met any of these folks, but they sure as hell were going to tell me what to tell them. Take a message back to the folks that they themselves didn't want to meet. And I told this one guy, we were at a bar one night. New Orleans, a lot of bars, you know, a lot of these conferences. This is not a good place to talk about racism, by the way. Don't talk about racism in a bar. It's never going to go well. It did not on this particular occasion. But we're sitting there having a drink, and this guy comes up and he says, what do you do? You know, whenever people ask that, they want to know what you do for a living. Not like what you do just as a human being on the planet. What do you do for recreation? What do you do for fun? Right. You know, they want to know what you do for a living. So I knew immediately what he wanted to know. I told him, and I was hoping he was just going to drop it, get his drink, move on. That was not going to happen. Right? I tell him I work in public housing as a community organizer. He goes, well, let me tell you what these people need. No, don't do this. Yeah, don't. Can I just buy you a drink? Because you clearly need that. Can I buy you a drink? You move on. I don't need to know what you want to tell these folks. He said, tell you what they need is they need some of these corporate executives, some of these CEOs who live on St. Charles Avenue, work for the oil and gas industry. Need to have some of them go into the projects and tell these people how to manage money. Yeah, I remember saying something to him that I can't repeat here, but it was something along the lines of, surely you jest. Right? It's a little bit rougher than that. It was rough enough that they threw me out of the bar, but as I was leaving, I was reminding him that surely he was in jest by making such a recommendation. I started to tell him as they were dragging me out, I said, you're telling me we need to have rich people, to have millionaires tell poor people how to manage money? Man, they don't even manage their own money. That's the thing about being rich. You don't manage your own money. You hire somebody else to manage it for you, right? So you don't have any skill at managing money. You just have a lot of it. Clearly, you can inherit $200 million from your daddy's real estate empire and still go bankrupt 4 times. So clearly, you don't know how to manage money just because you have a lot of money. How the hell, by the way, do you go broke 4 times when you inherit $200 million? Give me $200 million. I promise I will not go broke once. I used to get $5 allowances from my grandmother on the weekends. I never filed bankruptcy yet. $5 a week, and I didn't have to file bankruptcy. $200 million can't seem to make do. That's totally not the lecture tonight, but I just felt like saying it. So, in any event, we have these ideas, right, instilled by the culture about who is competent, who is not, who is intelligent, who is not, who is hardworking, who is not. And unless we fill in the blanks of how things come to be and how they come to look the way they are, unless we engender a sociological imagination in our children and foster one in ourselves, then we can't make sense. We can't make heads or tails out of what we see, right? And it was, in fact, that system of white supremacy that I want to talk about this evening that created the mentality that allows the poisoning of the people of Flint to happen, the mentality that allows the erosion of the levees in New Orleans, then overtopped by the floodwaters after Hurricane Katrina, to happen. It's the same mentality that allows city after city after city in this country to suffer under the weight of what we call urban renewal, but we know what that really was. It was black and brown folk removal. So we would knock down, and we did, from 1950 to 1969, 20% of all housing in this country lived in by African American peoples was knocked to the ground by the state and local governments with federal subsidies as well, so as to make way for what? Office buildings, shopping malls, and parking lots, right? It was the first form of gentrification. We didn't call it that then. We called it urban renewal or economic development policy. But 20% of all black housing knocked to the ground. And what happened? They didn't rebuild new units. See, that was the promise. The promise was, we're going to knock down they called them the slums. We're going to call it slum clearance. We're going to knock down the so-called slums, and then we're going to build nice new housing for folks. But that never materialized in virtually any community, and certainly never materialized in sufficient numbers to make up for the housing that was lost. About 1 out of 10 units at best that was knocked down was ever replaced, right? And so in a sense, you knock down 20% of the housing, you only built back 2%, in effect, 1/10 of what you knock down. That, of course, creates a crisis where folks have to double up in small apartments or move into public housing for the first time. Right? So the way that people end up in places like Cabrini Green, Robert Taylor in Chicago, the way they end up in Desire, right, or Magnolia in New Orleans, the way that they end up in spaces in Baltimore, in urban Baltimore, in the core of that city that then we only hear about 30, 35, 40, 45 years later when there's a so-called riot, right? And then we call that the violence. Why are these people violent?
Right.
Right? Why are they so violent? Why are they so angry? We have no historical context for that because the media wasn't there when the bulldozers knocked the buildings down. You throw a rock through a CBS glass plate window, and you'll have CBS and ABC and NBC and CNN and MSNBC and all of them there covering it. Geraldo will go into the midst of it and ask, why are y'all so angry? Why are you so violent? But nobody was there when the bulldozer did it and zoning laws did it and the government did it with our own money as taxpayers. That was violence. That was systemic and institutional. And that is every aspect of why certain people are pissed off now. But you can't understand the rage. You can't understand the anger unless you understand that. And we don't teach that. We don't talk about that. It's why terms like redlining and urban renewal are not really understood for what they were, which was systemic and institutional neglect. See, what we see with what's happened in Flint, what's happened in Baltimore, what's happened in New Orleans, and what's happening with this presidential campaign, these are two very good examples. On the one hand, what's happened to these 3 communities I mentioned, I'll talk about that in a second. On the other hand, what's going on with the campaign. 2 very good examples of pretty much the entire history of race and class in America.
Yep.
If you want to understand race and class in America, all you have to do is look at what has happened in Flint, in Baltimore, and New Orleans, and we could add lots of cities to that, right? But we'll just talk about those 3, and then look at what is going on in this presidential campaign, and you will have a very good understanding, a good Cliff Note level, at least, understanding of how race and class operate. Let's talk first about the 3 cities. So I think it goes without saying, and I'm in no need of persuading you, that what has happened in this community would not, by definition, I would bet not only those $5 Sunday allowances, but every dollar that I have ever made, ever in my life or ever will make, that such a thing would never happen in Grosse Pointe. It would never happen in Birmingham. It would never happen in Auburn Hills, where I was just the other day. It would never happen, at least on certain parts of Ann Arbor. Maybe other parts they let it happen, right? It wouldn't happen in any affluent community, especially an affluent white community in this state. There isn't any way that such a place would ever have a city manager, unelected, unaccountable to anyone placed there, no matter what. So it can happen in Benton Harbor, and it can happen in Flint, and it can happen in places like that. It's not going to happen in those, and it's not because they're so much better run. I'm sure there's plenty of corruption in such spaces. I'm sure there are plenty of issues in such spaces, but those individuals are allowed to continue to manage their own affairs, and money is never more of a priority than lives in those spaces. But in spaces that are working class in general, and also disproportionately of color in particular, and certainly when those 2 things are combined, right, all bets are off, and money becomes a much more serious consideration than the health, the well-being, and the lives of the people of that community. I think that goes without saying here, but what's important to understand is that it isn't just here. This is part of a long trajectory. See, my people, that is to say in the narrowest sense, those of us called white, like to look at everything as an isolated incident. We have a history of that. Everything's isolated, right? So Flint, that's a shame, but that's an isolated incident. Katrina, that's a shame, but that's an isolated incident. Baltimore, well, that's a shame, but that's an isolated incident. Tamir Rice, isolated incident, right? Rakia Boyd, isolated incident. Amadou Diallo, isolated incident. Akai Gurley, isolated incident. Laquan McDonald, isolated incident, right? Katherine Johnston, isolated incident, right? Mike Brown, isolated incident. All these incidents isolated, yet after a while, folks who live those isolated incidents, right, start to see patterns, like the old connect the dot things that you had when you were a kid. Like, you know, it didn't make any, or like the Magic Eye book. Y'all remember them? I bet they got some of them in this library.